Good morning, everyone. Maybe we should give 1 or 2 minutes to make sure that everyone is connected, and then we shall start. So, yes, maybe we should start. So again, thank you everyone for joining. I'm Sarah Farjani. I'm your moderator for this seminar today entitled Africa's Energy Transition, the Need for Gas, Nuclear, and Renewable. And this is a series of seminars that have been done in partnership between AUDA and NEPAD, African Development Agency, and the Institute for Security Studies. So there's a total of 8 seminars. Today is being the second one that just, as I said, it's been titled Africa's Energy Transition, the Need for Gas, Nuclear, and Webinar. So again, I'm Sarah Farjani. I'll be your host for today. And the format of this seminar will be first to cover basically what's been happening is like we are looking at some findings that have been done by the African Future Innovation Team on a modeling study examining Africa's current development path and the potential outcomes of adopting more sustainable energy policies and strategies. So today we'll be discussing, we'll be looking at the findings done by the ISS and diving into them and seeing some of the findings, what our expert would like to come in. And so I will introduce them as well. So first we'll go with Alice Leroux from ISS African Future, who will be doing the presentation findings. And then we have also Dr. Kennedy Manduna, Mrs. Kogelo Mkobeni, and Dr. Ruben Macomeri. So if you want to have more details about the biography, we'll put them in the chat. And also maybe for your information, so this is a live stream event on YouTube. So first we'll have the presentation and we'll have a few exchange among our panelists, experts, and following that we'll also have a Q&A. This is where we'll be able to maybe put your questions. So if you don't mind to maybe just write your question in the chat so we can try to address them at the last part in the Q&A. So again, this is a 1-hour session. So unfortunately, we don't have that much time. We'll try to bring as much information, really make it lively and organic. It's not a presentation. We want to have interesting interaction, and obviously everyone should participate. So I think I'll stop here. Again, it's 11:03. Yes, maybe Alice, if you want to start, and if anything, please feel free to put your question or your comments in the chat and we'll revert back. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. So earlier this year, myself and Dr. Yaki Silvier, I haven't checked if he has joined us yet, but we released 2 new reports, which is on our Africa Futures and Innovation website. So I am displaying our portal right now on the screen that all participants should be able to see. And these 2 reports are really around Africa's climate and energy future within the next couple of decades. You're very welcome to access them on our AFI platform. You can go under thematic. You'll see both of the reports here. And both of these reports are quite interactive in terms of the data that we offer, the graphs, the database, the various information pieces. And you can use any of these evidence for your decision-making or to embed it into your websites or into your reports. Just worth mentioning before we get into the meat of the discussion, that all of the forecasts that we do, all of the information, the graphs that you will see, we have produced this using a global integrated assessment model called the International Futures Platform. Okay, so these 2 reports are quite bulky. So I'm just going to take you through a summarized version of both of them and just to highlight some of the combined findings. I think everybody that is on this call today is very, very aware of the acute and escalating climate crisis that we are on. I mean, if you just spend one day reading news articles or listening to the news, you would know the severity of the situation. Last year, the world experienced record-breaking temperatures, the world being almost 1.48 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial levels. And nearly half of the days last year, we already exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. We even very, very briefly touched on the 2 degrees Celsius threshold in November of last year. So these really are alarming trends. And there's many, many studies coming out on a daily basis, that is attribution studies in science, that is really linking the intensification of weather events to climate change. And really that underscores the urgency of our responses and what is needed. But I think despite all the growing awareness, civil awareness, various policies coming out, CO2 emissions in the atmosphere is continuing to rise. So this is a graph that I'm showing of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. So globally, CO2 emissions from fossil fuel last year peaked at 36.1 billion tons. The atmospheric CO2 concentration in the atmosphere last year soared to 424 parts per million. So this is the end of this dark blue line here. Our forecasts, the AFI forecast using the IFS modeling platform on a current trajectory, are showing a very worrying trend. It shows us 515 parts per million by the year 2050. And I have to put this into perspective, because to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal alive, atmospheric CO2 concentration should be in that light blue line on the graph. So it should be between 330 and 400 parts per million by 2050. And we will exceed this on the current PAR forecast. We also know that currently there are 10 countries globally that is emitting nearly 70% of all fossil fuel emissions. And these are China, the US, India, Russia, Japan, Indonesia, Iran, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and South Korea. And Africa as a whole, as a continent, all of our 55 member states are emitting less than 5% of all global emissions. If we are expecting on our current PAR forecast that emissions will peak, so you can see it here in the graph at around 2033, then it will plateau and then it will slowly start declining. Africa's share, however, of global emissions is set to increase significantly. So currently 5%, contributing 5%, the continent will contribute roughly around 11% by 2050, mid-century, and then potentially reaching 16% by 2063. So this trend, I think, really highlights Africa's growing role in global emissions, and it underscores the urgency of a transition to cleaner energy sources. Currently, we also know, just before I go into that, so this is just a graph that shows you the various contributions of large emitting countries and regions. You can see China here in the olive color from 1960, peaking, where we are currently expected to continue with its peak before rapidly starting to come down in its emissions. The US having already peaked, but still dragging along with its reductions. And then India coming onto the scene and with a forecast of growing emissions. And then you can see Africa in this blue line as well, surpassing the emissions of China by around 2065. Currently in Africa, there's only a couple of countries that are responsible for the majority of the continent's fossil fuel emissions. In 2023, this is the picture that I have on the screen here. South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and Algeria accounted for nearly 70% of Africa's fossil fuel carbon emissions. South Africa share of, we are expecting that this picture will drastically shift within the next couple of decades. South Africa specifically, and I'm just going to put it on the screen. This is the 2063 picture. We know that South Africa's share of forecasted share will decrease rapidly to around 7% by mid-century. Algeria will decrease to around 5%. But Nigeria and Egypt's contribution, we are forecasting, in DR Congo's, will continue to rise. So Nigeria's contribution by mid-century is expected to be around 20% of Africa's contribution. And this rise in emissions really is the result of factors such as rapid population growth and expanded industrial activity and rising energy demands. So Nigeria, specifically for Africa, I think because of its large oil and gas resources, the fact that up until now it's really been struggling to fulfill its NDC commitments, will really be a major player on the continent in terms of contributing to this problem. In fact, actually, we are forecasting that by mid-century, Nigeria on its own would contribute around 4% of global emissions from fossil fuels. So it's really a challenge in terms of our regional and international efforts to combat climate change. South Africa, we can see, has dropped by mid-century, and this also is a response in terms of its policies and the work that it's done in the last couple of decades. So just to state that, I mean, there's many things we can do to address this challenge. Mitigation, of course, being very important. We're going to talk about the energy transition in a bit, but there's also various ideas, innovations coming to the front in terms of doing both mitigation, bringing down emissions much quicker. And one of these that's been punted by the World Bank, the IMF, and that African leaders are supporting as well is a call for a global carbon tax framework. So I just want to show and highlight some of these modeling that we've done. And just to quickly touch on the carbon tax framework that we've done, this really is around reflecting much of the thinking that's currently going on globally. So putting a tax on carbon emissions on the globe to enable to also reduce carbon taxing. So we looked at 4 scenarios, which really reflects much of the thinking that's currently being punted around. The one scenario is a wealthy pay scenario. So this is where you really tax wealthy nations based on their historical emissions and the link between emissions and economic growth. A second scenario we modeled using IFS was to look at the world's top 20 global polluters and taxing only those. That covers around 80% of all emissions. A third approach is to say this is a shared responsibility and there is a minimum carbon price that we apply to all countries to see what would be the impact of that. And then a fourth scenario that we modeled was to look at a differentiated pay responsibilities. So based on the income levels of various countries, they would be taxed according to that. So when we did the modeling, I think what was quite clear, and this is also the graph that I've put up on the screen right now, was that carbon taxing does work in terms of lowering emissions, but it only works if you have a global effort in addressing the problem. So otherwise, we see issues emerging such as carbon leakages, and we see very reactive approaches to trying and solve those carbon leakages, where you see industries moving their production to different countries that is not being currently taxed by certain or being taxed. The differentiated pay scenario, so this is the one here in the orange color, really does hold the biggest potential in terms of reducing carbon emissions. So what this scenario says is it is a global response, yes, but wealthier nations would be taxed much more than developing nations. We are also saying that those wealthy nations should use the tax that they've generated to help support developing nations in terms of getting much quicker to a greener energy transition, and that domestic revenue then in developing nations should be used to address their pressing needs and most likely to spend that on adaptation, as this would be a critical issue as well. So the differentiated carbon tax framework does hold the potential to reduce carbon emissions by around 15% by the year 2050 and almost 25% by the year 2063. So it is a very valuable tool. Currently, only about 6% of all GHG emissions are covered by a carbon tax. So we know that this is quite a powerful tool, but I do want to reiterate that on its own, this is not the solution. On its own, it will still result in parts per million CO2 concentrations being around 500 by the year 2050. And we said it needs to be between 330 and 400. So there's a lot of additional effort that is needed. And these include things like natural and artificial carbon sequestration. So for Africa, that would mean protecting its vast natural resources, its forests, specifically its savanna land, ensuring that our ecosystems are intact to act as a natural carbon sink, but also the investment in artificial carbon sequestration. Things like better land use management practices, particularly within the agricultural space. And then, of course, what we will spend a bit of time now for the next 5 or so minutes on an accelerated energy transition, really rapidly shifting towards cleaner energy sources on a scale and on a speed that we've not done before. So that brings us to Africa's poverty, or actually its energy poverty dilemma. So Africa's growing population, we know, faces a significant energy poverty problem, especially regarding access to electricity. Only 57% of the African population has access to electricity. So there are about 600 million people on our continent without access to electricity. To put this in contrast, outside of Africa, 98% of people have access to electricity. So energy poverty is particularly severe in Africa, and there's countries where it is really, really dire. Countries like Central African Republic, Chad, South Sudan, the energy poverty there is quite stark. We know that energy is very crucial for economic growth and human development. So rapid human development typically requires around 8.6 barrels of oil equivalent per person annually. Currently in Africa, the average is around 3.2 barrel of oil equivalent per person. And that is compared to a global average of around 13.6. So this disparity really underscores the urgent need for increased energy access to support economic growth on the continent, to improve living standards, and to bear in mind that the continent is still rapidly growing in terms of its population. So Africa's energy production also remains currently very reliant on fossil fuels. And this is the graph that's on the screen. In 2023, renewables contributed only 1.7% of the total energy mix on the continent. Oil accounted for just slightly less than 47%, gas for 31%, and coal for 17.6%. So the transition towards renewables, we know, will take years, if not decades, to gain sufficient momentum to really replace fossil fuels as a viable energy source on the continent. So UNEP UNEP released a report last year called the 2023 Production Gap Report. And in that report, they stated that to keep the ambition of the Paris Agreement alive, we need to phase out coal completely by 2040 globally. And we need to see a reduction in oil and gas production to a quarter of the levels we observed in 2020 by the year 2050. So this means phasing out coal and rapidly reducing oil and gas dependencies. And I mean, these goals are crucial. That's why I started off with showing the CO2 emissions. It is crucial for climate stability, but they do pose economic challenges, and particularly in Africa, they pose economic challenges to those countries heavily invested in fossil fuels. And there are about 20 African states that are very dependent on fossil fuels for energy production and for exports. So you can see here, this is the current path forecast as it is currently standing, green being the renewable uptake. You can see the current reduction in coal, although not completely phased out on the current path trajectory. And you can see the reduction in oil, and you can see the increase in gas. And then hydro also taking up more of the energy mix in the next couple of decades. Okay, so we modeled the impact of these recommendations. We took the UNEP report and we modeled what would that mean for Africa. So again, a reduction of fossil fuels, a heavy push on renewables, and energy efficiency increase, as well as carbon sequestration uptake. So when we modeled this, similar to the carbon tax, we looked at what would be the impact on Africa. In those four key themes, again, energy efficiency, carbon sequestration, increase in renewables, and then a reduction in fossil fuels. Completely phased out by 2040 coal, and then oil and gas significantly reduced. And this is the impact of those, of implementing the UNEP recommendations in Africa in the next couple of decades. So this is the current path. This is Africa's total energy production on the business as usual forecast, which is this blue line. You can see this is 2023 all the way out to 2063. And then implementing the UNEP recommendations, which result in this orange line that you see here. And what happens is this gap between what Africa would need in its energy and what it would be producing. And this is called the energy production gap. So this is the reality. What we're seeing here is that the suggestions by UNEP would have significant implications for African countries. It is clear that these recommendations cannot currently be fully adopted by Africa. Again, the end of coal by 2040, significant reductions in gas, oil, and scaling up of renewables are included in this scenario. So we know that Africa needs energy. Its population is growing very rapidly, and the current solutions are not being implemented fast enough to cover this gap. So there are many, and I want to reiterate, there's many promising renewable solutions that's emerging and that's also being adopted on the continent, but they need to be scaled up and they need to be taken up with a much greater speed than we've ever witnessed before. There are promising solutions like SMNR technologies that are coming onto the scene, but they are still probably about a decade away from being mainstreamed into the energy production mix. So within the next decade, the continent would need to rely on a transition fuel to be able to close this gap, and we are suggesting that that would be gas. So not phasing out all of the fossil fuels, but still relying on gas as a transition form for filling this gap and for allowing Africa actually the space it needs to grow. So the report that's on the website really goes into much more detail, and I do invite you to read that and to read the policy recommendations as well. But Sarah, then just in summary, despite all the numerous challenges that Africa does face when it comes to this green energy transition, it does hold an immense potential for renewable energy and technological advancements. It is complicated by the fact that it is so heavily reliant currently on fossil fuels, and also that there's not enough financial support for this green transition. The heavy debt burden and the insufficient support does make this challenge very stark and real, and also wealthy nations are falling short of their financial promises, and they're not holding to that, and that also complicates the matter. So Africa needs to be very delicate. I mean, it needs to reduce fossil fuel dependencies, but it also needs to address its immediate energy needs and its economic security. And this is a very fine balance, and it would require finances as well to do this. So the reality is that Africa would need a little bit more time for this energy transition. And if we talk about carbon budgets, the reality is it will eat up more of the remaining carbon budget, and the rest of the world would have to rely on less of that carbon budget within the next couple of decades. Okay, so I think, Sarah, that concludes the time that I've been allowed. So I'm going to hand over back to you.
Sure, thank you, Alice. And you've been good, barely 30, 45 seconds more, because I actually did check on the time. Well, thank you for opening the floor, and indeed very interesting presentation. I have a few questions already for myself, but for now, I'll ask maybe Kennedy and then Kwagelo, and to finish with Robin, if you have like immediate feedback, some insight that you would like to bring in, some questions. So let's start that. Again, because it's 11:23, so maybe let's try to keep it to 2-3 minutes per intervention, and then we can also again take question afterwards, take more question from the audience. Thank you. So please, Kennedy, if you may start. Kennedy, can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Oh, okay.
No, sorry, Jan. Sorry, you're still muted. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I was talking to myself. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And thank you very much, Elise, for a very moving and thought-provoking and also a very insightful presentation. On this topic, I would want to call it very topical and very righteous, like it's the time, because we are currently facing an existential crisis at the moment, where less emitters like Africa are those which are being affected more by the climate change. And yeah, because of that, I do have some takeaways, but in the interest of time, I will only maybe focus on 3 or 4. Why? Because there are a lot of moving parts in what we are being told, the just energy transition. A lot of many levels and many types of complexities, and a confusing mixture, if I can call it that. The first one I want to talk about is the political economy question. Issues around beneficial ownership issues around like who owns, who controls, who profits from the energy transition itself. The IMF report, which was released, I think, April of this year, it revealed that like 30% of the green or of the transitional minerals are found in the continent. In fact, are found in sub-Saharan Africa. But it is the same continent we are being told more than 600 million of its population are still off the grid. And if you are to look at it now, who is owning the means of production, the factors of production, when it comes to mining those critical minerals, which are like which we are being told critical minerals. But then if you are to look at it as well, our African Union deliberately calls them green minerals, not critical minerals, like for a reason, because they are saying no, they are not critical to us. Who determine their criticality? So now, if we are to look at the ownership structures, we go to the DRC, to Tanzania, to Zimbabwe, even to South Africa, many of the means of production of mining of these critical minerals are being owned and controlled by non-locals. And because of that now, we are witnessing like energy poverty. And energy poverty like is set to continue because our minerals are being exported like in their raw form. We have like the concept we say from the pit to the pot. To say a mineral is extracted in Zimbabwe, in DRC, in Tanzania, and just go to the pot straight in its raw form. And those communities where those minerals are being mined, they are now being called like the left behind. They are the sacrifice zones because you can look at those communities, they don't have also what electricity. They are part of the more than 600 million people in Africa who are still off the grid. So now the question is why there is a paradox of having a continent which is endowed with all those green minerals which are necessary for the transition, yet many of its citizens are still off the grid. And at the same time, we are witnessing a situation whereby Africa, which is a less polluter, we are told by Eduzet, say the whole continent, 54 countries, they like all of them, like in aggregate, they emit less than 4% of the global greenhouse like gases. But if you are to look at the impact of climate change, who is being affected more? Mostly Africans, because we don't have mitigation measures and a lot of problems like we have in the continent as well. So now the question I am trying to ask now is, whose transition is this? Is Africa ready for the transition itself? Say maybe we take South Africa as an example. South Africa like has got huge deposit of coal, and according to research, we are told if the current production of coal is to continue the way it is today, South Africa would need more than 250 years to deplete its coal. But then now we are now told go green. The question is also now, is just the energy transition in the continent, in African concept, number one, is it going to benefit Africa? Of course, we all want to fulfill like the Paris Agreement, say we want to lessen like our carbon emissions, but is it like whose interests are going to be served when it comes to that?
Sorry, Kennedy, I'll have to cut you here because I hear your point in this. It's very good point. So maybe if you can come back with your comments afterwards, and I'll pass the floor to Kogelo. So maybe you can jump on his question about how's the transition, and he mentioned the case of South Africa recall. So maybe it's something you can also try to bring some element of response, or also give in your comments, please.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Firstly, I just want to thank Elise for a very comprehensive scope on climate change issues when it comes to Africa. I think that your analysis was very Africa-centric and is definitely grounded in qualitative data that lends to its credibility. So thank you for that. For me, I think when it comes to the continent, it's very important that we move away from the thinking that we don't need to move to greener energy sources. It's very important for the continent now more than ever to also push the funding gap discussion. I mean, as we know, we contribute less than 5% to emissions, and it's now more important to then delve into how can we deal with Africa's climate challenges, and we cannot do so without adequate climate financing. Why is that so? Because in anything, in implementing your national determined contributions, you need to have financing for climate change, particularly when it comes to adaptation. I think in this conversation about the report, another very critical aspect of climate mitigation and of mitigating climate change has to be adaptation. For the continent, it is very, very, very lacking. We don't have enough institutional capacity for most countries to really meet the needs that the continent has when it comes to adaptation. And I also want to emphasize that when it comes to this year, we are looking forward to COP29. And I think for that, it's very important for us, as it's dubbed the Finance COP, it's very important for the continent to really secure adequate funding, not only for adaptation, mitigation, but loss and damage as well. I know that African negotiators are definitely advocating for adequate financing. But when it comes to the just transition, I mean, as we're seeing, the most developed countries are the ones who are emitting more. And I think we are definitely positioned well to push for an energy transition. The question is about pacing. In what pace do we push for that transition? And it obviously has to be differentiated across countries. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think when it comes to the just transition and the energy transition, we cannot discuss that without mentioning the strong need for investment in renewable energy, as well as targeted investment that speaks to the resources that are available in the respective countries. I mean, we have abundant resources when it comes to the continent. We have solar, wind, geothermal energy, but we only attract 2% of funding, which is very, very pitiful. So I just want to emphasize that in this conversation, we really delve into the need for financing when it comes to the transition. But not only that, to view climate change and these development strategies we're talking about now as very integral to African development. So we cannot speak about climate change in a way that is exclusive of national development planning, for example. Like all of this aligns with broader development goals, your SDGs, Agenda 2063, linking to key security challenges that the continent faces, including poverty eradication, food security. So yeah, I just want to emphasize that in that as well, a coordinated approach is very necessary so that we bridge the gap between and the balance that is necessary between adaptation and mitigation efforts. And the last thing as well, I just want to emphasize the pressing need for capacity building and investment for countries. So I'm very grateful for this report because it's a tool that policymakers can use when it comes to development planning. And in closing, because I know I have to be quick, I want to emphasize that as a continent, we have the advantage of having over 60% of the population being under 25. And I think that's a very, very brilliant thing for us because it means that we can harness this population in terms of boosting our development opportunities, whether it be in climate change, energy, building resilience, creating jobs. So for a more resilient and sustainably developed future, I think that we have got to engage all of these things that I've mentioned, and I'm going to leave it here. so that we can have a broader conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I can see there's already a few points made in the chat, so please feel free to keep adding your input and your comments so that we'll address them during the Q&A. So yes, indeed, very interesting point. But I mean, Kennedy mentioned the perception on what actual the needs, and then you touched upon the climate financing, which is very important. And also, well, the mitigation, how long will you take, and also how it has to be coordinated with other action for the continent. Ruben, what would you want to add it, or maybe also still come back to the presentation and maybe see if there's something that you felt has been missed out or that you wanted to pinpoint as well?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that opportunity. Indeed, it was quite a fascinating report, and I'd like to thank Elise for putting together that presentation and sharing the report. I read through both reports that were referenced. It's clear that it's quite a heavy report to summarize in 15 minutes. And so congratulations on that. And also it's very clear that a lot of work went into preparing those models. And so that is something that I just a quick note there to say, appreciate that work. It's also interesting because the issues that are raised in the report, particularly on the mechanisms that are being proposed to accelerate this sort of shift away from carbon, particularly the global carbon tax, is something that certainly is an issue area in the global conversation. And it's also important that it's brought in front and center into the sort of conversation about how Africa navigates sort of responses, policy responses to climate change, for example. And so that's one of those things where it's greatly appreciated that it brought that kind of discussion to the surface. And as the presentation was going on, I just couldn't help but think about the key question of framing in terms of how we look at the climate question in the context of the continent of Africa and its diversities within, because one very important point is that when you talk about Africa, yes, it's often sort of framed in discussion as this, one constituency, But even within the continent, we have very diverse needs and interests, concerns that impact how Africa as an aggregate of 54, 55, jurisdictions come together to set policy that it eventually engages with the world. And a key point that has been raised, not only in the presentation, but also in the responses that have come before me, which are also brilliant, is this question of how to defend the right to development in terms of framing how we address climate, the issue of climate change. Because at global level, the narratives can be diluted, particularly on this issue of development. And we've seen that over the last 20 years of the evolution of climate governance. So, for example, we've seen a sort of weakening of the common but differentiated responsibility principle. Over the years, we've seen a shift from the sort of heavy focus on sort of adaptation and all this sort of developmental adjacent issues into a very, very heavy focus on mitigation. This kind of shift in discourse and the pushing of policy solutions that more often than not are not fit for purpose for Africa's very unique circumstances. As was mentioned, the demographic profile of Africa is unique in its in the world. You know, it's the only region in the world where we're seeing the kind of demographic profile and the questions that it raises insofar as policy responses are concerned are very unique to the continent compared to other regions of the world. And that's just one aspect of it. We have changing sort of geopolitical and geoeconomic profile, for example, configurations that will have significant influence on how Africa moves when it comes to securing some of its core interests in, let's say, the global climate regime and all these other sort of global platforms where there's an expectation of cooperation. And so when we think about how to approach these mechanisms like the carbon tax and how to think about these models, for me, the key question is how do we defend Africa's right to development and frame the climate question within that context, and not the other way around, where now Africa's developmental priorities are in service of the climate framing that is more often than not responsive to the kind of concerns that we have. And also, just a codicil to that is the kind of uncertainties, and we've seen over the last few years how uncertainty can shape the kind of policy options and decision options that our own decision makers have to make. Nobody would have predicted what happened in Sahel 10 years ago, for example, you know. And so as we start to think forward and forecast some of the implications of these policy questions, it is also necessary to also think about, in a rapidly changing world, in a rapidly changing continent, how uncertainty factors in and what kind of assumptions go into exploring the kind of policy questions. And that connects to the points that have been raised, political economy questions, for example, critical mineral questions, and all these things that policymakers have to contend with in sort of walking the tightrope between achieving the kind of developmental aspirations captured in the Agenda 2063, the moonshots in the second decade of implementation, etc., and a climate-constrained world that Africa has to also navigate. And there's also another question.
Sorry, Ruben, I think I'll have to cut
This
you
one.
in on this one. But thank you. I mean, all of you have been making definitely very valid point, and kind of meeting in, for example, Kennedy's point about like the perception, how we should also defend our interests for the continent. I've seen there's already been a couple of questions in the chat, so maybe maybe you should let me read some of them, and we can also start addressing them because they're kind of linking back to what you all have said. So I've seen first as a comment the fact that it would be from, let me see again, it was from Amina Yelchev about the over also African country. There's also a tendency towards overconsumption of energy at local level, so growing need to educate communities and population how to reduce the consumption. Indeed, so that's mostly a comment, but how we also need to look at addressing awareness at local in the local communities. And now with like there was like two questions. First one was coming from Guillemette, addressing what are the key priorities for African countries when it comes to climate financing, such as adaptation, renewable. And second question was also maybe will be for you, Alice, which African countries are leading the call for climate transition reform? So again, maybe to all the panelists for the first question, what do you believe are the key priorities for African country for climate financing, adaptation, and renewable? Maybe I'll ask maybe Kogelo to respond, and okay, Nidhi or Ruben, if one of you wants to respond to that question directly. Okay,
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. So the first question, what are the key priorities for African countries when it comes to climate financing, such as adaptation and renewable energy? That was the first question. And again, the following question was, which African countries are really leading the call for climate transition reforms? So who would like to come first on what are the priorities for the countries when it comes to climate financing?
May I go
Please go
first?
ahead.
May I go first?
Please go ahead, yes.
Okay, I'll try to answer this question as best as I could. So like I said, adaptation for the continent is a very, very important question and is a critical priority. I mean, I think we need about 15 billion annually for adaptation on the continent. So you already see that there is a substantial funding gap. And Africa receives, I think, less than 4% of global funding when it comes to climate finance, which is so little, considering the fact that we lack the institutional capacity to deal with adaptation. So I think oftentimes we're seeing a lot of funding going into mitigation as opposed to adaptation initiatives. So that's a key one. And I know that the 4 African leaders, like your Africa group of negotiators, championing the global goal on adaptation, particularly at the UNFCCC level, is critical because it will allow an organized approach towards also establishing like the modalities of which sectors get funding and how the continent deals with adaptation. Second one is loss and damage financing. So loss and damage, basically to deal with the effects of climate change that are beyond adaptation efforts is very important because this will allow the continent to basically finance and deal with those needs. So the loss and damage fund is something that I know is an initiative that negotiators are also advocating for in order to fulfill the commitment, and they are pushing developed countries to fulfill the commitment that is needed to loss and damage financing. I think, again, when it comes to renewable energy and green energy on the continent, obviously this is, again, a very strong demand, and transitioning to a low carbon economy, it's not just about moving to renewables, but actually a holistic transition to low carbon is important because this can then empower local communities, particularly youth and women, in order to stimulate economic growth while addressing climate change. Yeah, I'll leave it here.
Vera, I'm gonna jump in.
Please go ahead,
think she excellently answered that question, but we need all of it. Just to answer the question that was posed around which African countries are leading the call. I mean, there are several fantastic examples emerging from the continent. Maybe to mention just a couple of those, if we look towards things like climate diplomacy, I mean, we need to acknowledge the role of a country like Egypt when they host COP27 and the significant role that they played there, specifically with regards to pushing for a loss and damage and putting that on the agenda fund. Kenya, its renewable energy sector is really fantastic, and they've not just been an advocate of renewable energies, they've invested heavily in that. And we see that as well. So I think there's a brilliant example. And then South Africa, as a very fossil fuel dependent economy, coal-based primarily, I mean, they've made significant strides. And I would go as far as to say they've been a leader in terms of the energy transition from fossil fuel dependency, while they're still very, very reliant. The NDC commitments, the just energy transition, the pathway that we're on, the fact that renewable energies have been adopted at the scale and speed that we're seeing in South Africa, it is really a good case example. And that's also why in those forecasts, you see the reduction from its 2023 fossil fuel or its carbon emissions and how that scales down by 2063. Nigeria, says a lot, but we are yet to see practical adaptation, mitigation responses coming out of the country, and that's why, again, they fail to deliver on the NDC commitments, and that's why in our forecasting we still see them as a heavy emitter of CO2 by 2063, based on their current energy mix, based on the current resources within the country, and just what we are seeing emerging out of it. And then maybe probably last example is a country like Ethiopia that's also invested heavily in adaptation and resilience building, particularly when it comes to drought, responding to drought, water management, as well as the agricultural sector. I mean, there's been marvelous strides. So those are just a couple of examples, and I'm sure there's many more when we get to hydro energy, for instance, in the DRC and so forth.
Thank you. Okay, so maybe let me jump to the other question because it's kind of leading to that. So this lady was asking about the governance, and as Africa, are we equipping our current and future leaders with knowledge in order to make informed decision that will influence the future of energy? So I think it's kind of been addressed. So maybe, I mean, we're seeing that different countries have different strategies. So maybe, I don't know if it's about collective knowledge, or how different all the countries are trying to respond, or they are, I mean, informed enough. So I don't know who would like to jump in.
I think in the question of capacity and energy in Africa, like there's a necessity to approach it in sort of a dual sort of pathways, if you like. On one hand, we have that sort of at collective level, where there's a lot of work, obviously, that has gone into trying to build the knowledge base and trying to engage policymakers in understand the kind of decision options that they have. And work such as what is being done and presented today is kind of part of that repertoire, or that of work that produces the kind of knowledge for policymakers. So there is but at the same time, there's the other strand where, as we know, different regions and countries in the continent have very diverse contexts within which they make their decisions, and that can also affect how we perceive and understand the capacity needs for these diverse countries. So if you're talking about countries in the Sahel or Central Africa, they'll have very different understandings of what they need as compared to a Kenya or something like that, right? And so you get this kind of nuanced approach to what is needed, and what we mean by capacity required to achieve the kind of visions of transition that we're thinking about.
Okay, thank you. So before I go to the other question, if everyone could take a moment to complete the evaluation poll, just a survey for everyone to respond to. It's anonymous, and it's very helpful for the team so that they can better prepare for the other events. Thank you. So now let me maybe go to that other question, which is I mean, again, addressed to all, and maybe Kennedy, I'll let you answer first. How do you see the current advocacy effort by African country and other stakeholders from different sectors, also in relevant international institutions, aiming to better consider African needs in global planning, target setting, financing, and implementation initiative? Yes, Kennedy, do you want to come in first for this question? At the first part of the question, and then I'll follow. Kennedy, are you still here unmuted? Okay. Okay, so I mean, okay, I think he might have an issue. So then maybe I'll ask Kogelo and Ruben if they also want to have respond to the question of I think it's kind of what you touched based at the current advocacy effort and what needs to be done in global planning. So I don't know. How would you?
I'll frame the response this way, and maybe can take over from there. In terms of advocacy, I think we've certainly seen an increase in, I guess, activity around awareness around trying to mainstream climate into national development agendas. We've seen that feed into national policies, good, bad, and different. And so that is one way we can say clearly there's an uptick in the kind of responsiveness to the information that is the climate advocacy that has emerged over the recent years, certainly in policy spaces. However, I think what is also emerging, on the other hand, is a more nuanced sort of understanding of what climate means to different communities in the continent, as differentiated from sort of global advocacy on climate governance. And this is happening at global level. So we're seeing the translation of this climate message into very sort of discrete needs of different sectors, different communities, demographics, etc. And that's something that I think should be encouraged, because that's how you start to get a flavor of the kind of contextual dynamics around this issue of climate, that then position both individual countries and the continent to demand for or advocate for, conduct their climate diplomacy in a way that is more responsive and not just reactive to the global narratives, and sort of just implement what has been said in other places. And so that is where I see quite an interesting dynamic playing out.
Thank you. Okay, Kennedy, are you able to come in?
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
I think it's a very critical question because it speaks about African agency. To say, like, where are we as Africans when it comes to determining our future, our self-determination, and all that. So, like, when it comes to, say, climate financing, I want to connect it, like, with the previous question regarding the priorities of climate finance and also, like, renewable energy. To say, how is Africa going to finance or going to get the funding to transition from fossil fuel? And so if you are to look at country case studies, maybe I was zero in on South Africa at the COP26 in Glasgow, where the Just Energy Transition concept was formulated, and also the Just Energy Transition partnerships also came into being. South Africa was promised about between 8 to 11 billion US dollars by the donors or the funders, German, US, etc. To say this, like, we are going to give you like this loan to help you to transition, right? But then South Africa has to do its own investigation to say how much do we really need for the transition itself. And believe me, well, like the report which came out late last year, it revealed that like the country needs close to 100 billion US dollars, right? And if it needs like such a huge amount of money, where it is going to come from? Like, are we capable of raising that money internally? Of course not. And so it now speaks about like issues around debt. We know like the country's debt to GDP ratio now is now over 70%. And if you are to say, how are we going to finance our renewable energy? If you are to go borrowing route, we know like the implications of that. We can also go bankrupt. So we are talking about South Africa, like the big economy. What about other African countries? Number two, we talk about like illicit financial flows in many countries. Like when we are talking about like smuggling of our minerals and also leakages, like a whole lot of other things. So now, even if like mining of those critical or strategic minerals is being done, who is benefiting? Or are we getting the money like in our coffers? Of course not. So the issues around how to finance either climate or like renewable energy is very fundamental, because Africa, even if we do have everything we need, we are not capable of financing it ourselves. So we need now to talk about issues around debt cancellation as a form of reparations. For example, like there's a report we recently like released about how Africa is advocating to be involved in the multilateral governance architect. One of the advocates like is to say we want debt cancellation and conditional, not debt restructuring, like what we've been seeing, and also the decolonization and the reformation of the international governance board itself. To say we want like not to continue to be rule takers, we also want to be rule makers. How can you say you come to us and tell us go green without our own input? I think I can stop.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wanted, Kogelo, did you want to maybe add in or should I let Alice come in?
I can add in, I just saw a comment about risks associated with the just transitions itself. And I can reference South Africa as a case example. In South Africa, there was a closing of a power station that employed quite a lot of people in a specific community in Komati. And I think that the effects of the closing of that power station, it was not because of the just transition, but just to give you an example of how it is critical to have conversations about bringing in the just elements of transitions as well, and also tailoring how we consider our climate priorities and policies to the specific locations. So yeah, I definitely agree. I think there is a need for a broader conversation. And when it comes to advocacy, I think that as a continent, we're heading in the right direction. There is a lot of work that is required in terms of having a unified approach, especially at your global conferences, and as well as when it comes to also accepting funding from foreign donors. So I think when it comes to that, a key feature for me that's always a reminder of how well we're starting out is the Nairobi Declaration that was created at the first Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, which I think is significant for the continent because it is a key feature of guiding the continent in terms of how it responds to certain issues in multilateral fora. So yeah, I think there is a lot of work that's required, particularly at your regional level and like your economic communities as well. But I think that we even convening in this manner is a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Clearly we have reached the end. It's 12, but I can see there's still a lot of questions and comments about what's been discussed. And clearly, Alice, I would say that it seems like you will need to do a lot more of those webinars because now we're touching about climate financing, and clearly there's a lot more that could be unpacked. So but then we are restricted, unfortunately, by time. And again, to everyone who has putting the inputs in the chat, thank you so much. Feel free still you can send an email to the team, and hopefully they'll be able to respond to you and get back to you, because again, this is webinar 2 of those 8 webinars. So not everything can be covered, but at least we try to kind of have a broad outlook of what was discussed. So thank you all again for your inputs. Maybe before I close in, just to let everyone know that there's gonna be another, so again, today was number 2 seminar. So next week will be next week Friday, same time 11. The focus will be at still same time will be on gender equality and catalyst for Africa future development. So again, you can register for this webinar and hopefully take part of it, also bring a contribution. Well, I had also so many questions, but I've seen that clearly it would take another hour to be able to address them all. So again, thank you all for participating. I don't know if Alice, would you like maybe to bring some closing comments before I close in the session? Thank you.
No, but thank you very much, Sarah. I think the concluding remark for me is we probably need a follow-up seminar or discussion that speaks around climate financing initiatives and everything that's happened in the last year, because this is such a dynamic space. And I think after COP29, there would also be quite a lot of new and additional discussion points as well.
Sure. So clearly, yes, I think everyone will be expecting to hear more on the subject. So again, thank you so much. I was Sarah Fredgen, I was your host. And again, if you have any question for the panels, and if you want to discuss with them more, I'm pretty sure the team will be able to share some information. Also, you can send them your question, and hopefully they'll be able to get back to you. So on that note, if there's no further question, I'd like to close this webinar. Thank you so much. It's been very instructive for me as well. And I think there's a lot more that needs to be unpacked. And obviously, we're not going to come up with solution on the bat, but we are leading in the right direction, as our panelists have said, and we are able to see as a continent that we know what are the issues, and we want to be able to address them in our own ways with our own solutions. So hopefully we'll get to it, though it's definitely challenging. So thank you all, and I think I'll stop here. Thank you.